If you've ever worked alone at night, especially somewhere the public can just walk into, then you probably already know there's a point in the shift where the building stops feeling like a workplace and starts feeling like a test. Not because anything obvious happens. Usually it's the opposite. It's the silence. The long gaps between people, the hum of machines, the weird way certain lights flicker when there's no reason for them to. The feeling that every sound means more than it should because there's nobody else around to absorb it with you. Night shifts do something to your sense of normal. Not all at once, slowly. They stretch small things. A door chime, a footstep, a cough from the back room, a reflection you can't explain right away. During the day, those things slide past you. At 3 in the morning, they stay. That's what this story is really about. And before I get into it, no, I wasn't drunk. I wasn't hallucinating. And I wasn't looking for something scary to happen. I wasn't ghost hunting. I wasn't filming content. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I took that job because I needed money fast. That's the most ordinary part of the whole story. I was 24, living in a small town in Pennsylvania, and my life at that point was exactly the kind of messy that makes people take jobs they don't really want. My roommate had moved out with barely any notice. Rent didn't stop because somebody else became irresponsible. My car payment was behind. I had just enough savings left to understand that I didn't really have savings. A friend of a friend told me Harlow's Market needed overnight help. Market made it sound nicer than it was. It was really a gas station with a convenience store attached, just off a state route outside town, near the edge of a long wooded stretch where the houses started thinning out and everything got darker faster than it did in town. In daylight, it was forgettable. Coffee station, lottery, cigarettes, cheap windshield wiper fluid, rotating hot dogs under a heat lamp no one should have trusted. The kind of place people stop at because it's there, not because they love it. At night, it felt separate from everything. That wasn't just because it got quieter. It was because the station sat in this awkward in-between place, not remote enough to be isolated on purpose, not close enough to town to feel watched. There was a patch of woods behind it, an old service road off to one side, a narrow creek further up the route, and long empty minutes between headlights. You could stand outside the store after 2 a.m. and hear almost nothing. No neighborhood noise, no nearby houses, just insects in the warmer months, wind if there was any, and the occasional truck taking the route too fast. There were only 2 regular overnight workers at that point. Me, once I started, and a woman named Karen. Karen had been there for years. She was in her 50s, chain smoked on brakes, hated almost everyone equally, and had the kind of calm that only comes from spending too long around drunk customers, weird regulars, and low-level emergencies. She was the sort of person who could tell you 3 unsettling things in a flat voice while wiping down a coffee counter, and you still wouldn't fully realize she was being serious until later. She trained me for 3 overnight shifts. The first night was mostly routine. She showed me how to reset pump errors, how to count cigarette inventory, what shelf tags the owner cared about, which customers to watch, which truckers paid exact change every time, and how the office camera system froze if you clicked too fast between feeds. The second night was when she said the first thing that should have made me pay more attention. It was around 2 a.m. We were both behind the counter and there hadn't been a customer in maybe 15 minutes. She was refilling the stirrers and I was trying to memorize cigarette shelf codes. Out of nowhere, she said, "If the bell over the front door rings and you didn't see anybody come in, don't call out right away." I laughed because I thought she was trying to mess with the new guy. She didn't laugh back. Then she said, "Look at the mirrors first." The store had 2 convex security mirrors up in opposite corners so you could catch blind spots in the aisles. I asked why. She shrugged and said, "Because sometimes people stand where they shouldn't." That line sat in my head for maybe 10 seconds before I filed it away with every other weird night shift comment I'd ever heard at low-paying jobs. Places like that always have folklore. A freezer that likes to shut on people. A regular customer everybody thinks is cursed. A stockroom everyone swears smells weird after midnight. Usually it's boredom mixed with routine. I assumed this was more of the same. The third night, she said something else. She told me that the worst time on the shift was between 3 and 4 in the morning. I asked if she meant because of drunks. She said, That's just when the night gets strange." Again, completely flat. Again, I ignored it. The layout of the place matters, so I'm going to explain it properly. The front counter faced the entrance. The main door was glass with a cheap electronic bell mounted above it that made a bright little ding every time the door opened. To the right of the entrance were refrigerators with soda, water, juice, and energy drinks. Past that was a narrow aisle with chips and crackers, then another with medicine, paper towels, and small household stuff. To the left of the entrance were candy, gum, lighters, cheap phone chargers, motor oil, and random convenience. Store junk no one plans to buy until they see it. Behind the counter were cigarettes, the lottery terminal, the coffee station, and a small side office with a desk, a safe, and an old monitor system hooked up to 6 security cameras. One camera showed the register and entrance, one showed the parking lot, one showed the pumps, 2 covered the store interior from different angles. The last one covered the side lot, delivery door, and dumpster area. Behind the sales floor through a narrow hall were the employee bathroom, stockroom, and a back exit that almost nobody used except for deliveries. The cameras were decent enough to settle theft arguments and bad enough to make everything else uncertain. That ended up mattering a lot. My first week alone was quiet, not peaceful quiet. There's a difference. Peaceful means the silence feels earned. Quiet means you just notice too much. After midnight, I mostly got truckers, people buying cigarettes, couples fighting quietly while one of them picked out drinks, and the occasional guy wandering in for chips and motor oil at an hour that made you wonder what exactly had happened to his night. Nothing scary, nothing that would become a story. Then, on my 8th shift, the bell over the front door rang at exactly 3:12 a.m. That exact time ended up mattering enough that I still remember it down to the minute. I know because I looked at the register clock immediately after the bell rang. 3:12 a.m. At first, I did what anybody would do. I looked up at the door. It was closed. No customer standing there, no car pulling in, no taillights leaving the lot, nothing. I remember staring at the door for a second, half expecting it to swing open late like the bell had gone off too soon. It didn't. Then, for no good reason except that Karen's voice popped into my head, I looked at the convex mirror in the back corner. A man was standing in aisle 3. At least I thought he was. He was only half visible in the curve of the mirror. Tall, thin, dark jacket, standing in that still way customers usually don't. Not browsing, not reaching for anything. Just there. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was irritation. I assumed I'd somehow missed someone walking in while I was looking down at the till. So I said, "Sorry, be right with you." No answer. I stepped out from behind the counter to see the aisle directly. It was empty, completely. No person, no moving shadow, no sound of footsteps. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, annoyed at myself for getting turned around by a mirror. Then I looked back up at it. The aisle was still empty. I was just about to return to the register when the coffee receipt printer behind the counter spit out a slip. It startled me enough that I actually jumped. I walked over, tore it off, and looked at it. No item list, no total, no transaction, just a timestamp. 3:12 a.m. 14, and underneath it, one line, "Thank you, come again." He hadn't rung anyone up. I hadn't touched the machine. Nobody was in the store. That bothered me enough that I kept the slip and taped it inside the office for Karen. When she came in just before 6, she read the note I left with it, looked at the slip, and didn't seem nearly as surprised as she should have. That was the first moment I really understood there was a difference between not believing me and not wanting to explain. I asked if the register had ever done that before. She said, "Sometimes the system spits out phantom entries." I asked what that meant. She said, "It means don't be here after closing if the bell rings twice." I stared at her. "We don't close." She nodded once and said, "Exactly." Then she grabbed her bag and left. If I'd had another option for rent that week, I probably would have quit. Not because I thought something supernatural was happening, but because I hated the feeling of being the newest person in a place where everybody older clearly knew something and had silently agreed not to say it directly. Morning made it easier to dismiss, though. That's one of the weirdest things about night experiences. Sunlight humiliates them. By noon, everything feels more explainable. Bad printer, faulty bell, mirror angle, lack of sleep. An old employee with a dark sense of humor. Then 3 nights later, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the bell rang again. This time I looked up immediately. The door was shut, and before I even checked the mirror, I felt that drop in my stomach that happens when your body recognizes a pattern before your brain is ready to accept it. I looked at the mirror. Same aisle, same shape. A man standing in aisle 3, angled slightly toward the counter, like he was waiting for me to notice him. I didn't call out this time. I turned and looked straight into the aisle. Empty. When I looked back at the mirror, he was gone. Then I heard something slide off a shelf. Not fall hard. Slide. A careful sound. I moved into aisle 3 and found a bottle of children's cough syrup on the floor. Nothing else disturbed. No sign that someone had rushed away. No open door. No shifting shadows. I bent down to pick it up, and when I stood, I saw someone in the reflection of the freezer door at the far end of the store behind me. Near the entrance, I spun around. Nobody there. That was the first time the fear felt physical. Not just nerves, not just being unsettled, The kind of fear that makes you suddenly aware of the distance from the register to the back hall, from the front door to the road, from your own voice to the possibility that nobody would hear it if you yelled. I locked the front door. We weren't supposed to unless there was an emergency, but at 3 in the morning on a slow weeknight, no manager was watching the live feeds closely enough to catch it. Then I sat in the office and watched the cameras. Nothing came in. Nothing went out. The pumps were empty. The lot was empty. Then the camera facing the front counter flickered. Once, when it came back, there was a man standing at the register, dark jacket, head slightly lowered, hands at his sides. I looked up at the actual counter, empty, back to the monitor. Still there. Then the image skipped like a lagging video feed, and the counter was empty again. That was when I called Karen. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding irritated but not surprised to hear from me at that hour. I told her what I'd seen. There was a pause. Then she asked, "Did he look wet?" That question made my whole body go still, because yes, on the monitor, the jacket had looked darker at the shoulders and sleeves, not shiny, exactly. Just damp. I said yes. Karen was quiet for a second, then said, "Don't go into the back hall tonight." I asked what that meant. She said, "Just don't." Then she hung up. There is almost nothing more infuriating than being frightened and also feeling managed. If she had just said, "I don't know," I might have listened. But people only ration information when they think they understand the shape of your fear better than you do. So I did the obvious stupid thing. I grabbed the flashlight from under the register and went into the back hall. The hall was narrow, off-white, and ugly in the worst possible way, ordinary ugly. One vending machine at the end, one bathroom door, one stockroom door, one back exit. No drama in the space itself. At first, nothing looked wrong. Then I looked down. There were wet shoe prints on the floor, not muddy, not dripping, just wet. A partial trail they led out from the stockroom, across the hall, toward the front of the store. I stood there staring at them because they looked so normal that for a second I convinced myself maybe I'd tracked them in earlier without noticing. Then I looked at the soles of my own shoes, dry, and the prints weren't leading in, they were leading out. I followed them into the sales floor. They continued up the center aisle toward the counter and then stopped halfway between aisle 3 and the register. Not faded out, stopped. Like whoever made them had simply ceased to exist past that point. There was no stockroom camera. I know that sounds obvious now, but I hadn't really registered it before. We had 6 cameras and none of them covered the one place where the footprints had started. The next morning I refused to let Karen leave until she told me what was going on. At first she acted like I was overreacting. Then I told her I was quitting unless she explained at least enough for me to know what I was dealing with. She leaned against the counter, lit a cigarette outside the front door, came back in, and told me the story in the same flat tone she used for everything. About 9 months before I started, a man came into the store just after 3 a.m. during a storm. According to Karen, he was soaked through, pale, shaking, and talking like somebody who'd either hit his head or was halfway into shock. He said his truck had gone off near Miller's Creek and he needed a phone. That particular night, weather had knocked out parts of the phone line. Cell service in that area got bad during storms anyway. Karen told him to wait while she tried the office line again. Then, according to her, a customer came in. Then the card reader froze. Then there was some kind of issue with a beer delivery stacked wrong near the back. Everything got broken into normal little work emergencies. By the time she came back to the front, the man was gone. She assumed he'd left. About an hour later, state police came in asking whether anyone had seen a local man whose truck was found near the creek after the storm. Karen gave them the description. It matched. His name was Daniel Mercer, 38, construction worker, divorced. Had a reputation for drinking too much, which in a small town means half the people who hear your name already think they know the ending. I asked Karen why aisle 3 mattered. She said that was where Daniel had stood dripping water while waiting for the phone. Then I asked why she told me not to go into the back hall. She looked away and said, "Because if he doesn't see anybody out front, sometimes he checks the stockroom." That should have ended the job for me. It didn't. Again, rent. People underestimate how much fear your financial situation can teach you to negotiate with. For the next week, nothing happened. No bell at 3:12 a.m., no figure in the mirror, no printer slip, no wet footprints. That quiet was almost worse because it gave me time to think, and thinking is dangerous after something unsettling. Either you talk yourself into total disbelief or you become hyper-alert to every little thing. I started doing both. Maybe I was primed now. Maybe Karen's story had infected the store with meaning. Maybe every old building has bad systems and weird reflections and tired employees who teach each other to fear patterns that aren't really there. Then Thursday came. 3:12 a.m. The bell rang. And before I even looked up, I heard a wet, choking cough from aisle 3. I froze. That sound is still one of the worst parts for me because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a horror movie effect. It sounded exactly like what it was supposed to sound like, a man who had swallowed water or breathed too hard in cold air and couldn't quite catch his chest up with him. I looked in the mirror. He was there. Clearer than before. Dark jacket soaked through. Thin face, shoulders slightly hunched. Not staring at me exactly. More like waiting to see if I had noticed him. For the first time I could actually make out his expression. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. And scared. Then he lifted one hand slowly and pointed toward the back hall. At that exact moment, the bell over the front door rang again. Once, then immediately a second time. I remembered what Karen said. Don't be there after closing if the bell rings twice. We didn't close. Exactly. The whole store went quiet in a way I still can't describe properly. Not silent. Quiet. The refrigerators still hummed. The lights still buzzed faintly. But everything sounded lower, like the building had inhaled and decided to wait. Then the lights flickered once, and the power went out. The whole store dropped into darkness except for the red glow of the exit sign and the weak battery light from the lottery machine. I grabbed the flashlight and backed toward the office. Then I heard the stockroom door open, slowly. Not a slam, not a rattle. A hinge drag, then wet footsteps coming down the hall. I got into the office, locked it, and stared at the monitor system as it rebooted onto backup power, one camera at a time. Front counter, parking lot, pumps, inside aisle. Aisle 3. On the aisle 3 camera, Daniel was standing in the frame, facing the lens. Then something moved behind him. At first I thought it was a distortion in the feed. Then it rose, not all at once, gradually, from low and hunched to tall enough that it broke the shape of the aisle behind him. It was darker than the rest of the image, but not like a shadow. More like the camera didn't know how to render it correctly. Daniel turned toward it in the frame. Not like a ghost appearing for a scare, like a person hearing something behind them that they were already afraid of. Then the feed cut to static. That was the first night I called the police. Once, then immediately a second time. I remembered what Karen said. Don't be there after closing if the bell rings twice. We didn't close. Exactly. The whole store went quiet in a way I still can't describe properly. Not silent. Quiet. The refrigerators still hummed. The lights still buzzed faintly. But everything sounded lower, like the building had inhaled and decided to wait. Then the lights flickered once, and the power went out. The whole store dropped into darkness except for the red glow of the exit sign and the weak battery light from the lottery machine. I grabbed the flashlight and backed toward the office. Then I heard the stockroom door open, slowly. Not a slam, not a rattle. A hinge drag, then wet footsteps coming down the hall. I got into the office, locked it, and stared at the monitor system as it rebooted onto backup power, one camera at a time. Front counter, parking lot, pumps, inside aisle. Aisle 3. On the aisle 3 camera, Daniel was standing in the frame, facing the lens. Then something moved behind him. At first I thought it was a distortion in the feed. Then it rose, not all at once, gradually, from low and hunched to tall enough that it broke the shape of the aisle behind him. It was darker than the rest of the image, but not like a shadow. More like the camera didn't know how to render it correctly. Daniel turned toward it in the frame. Not like a ghost appearing for a scare, like a person hearing something behind them that they were already afraid of. Then the feed cut to static. That was the first night I called the police. The bell started ringing on nights with no customers. The aisle 3 camera developed a flicker that only happened between 3:10 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. Twice I found damp arcs under the coffee station, like someone had stood there dripping and slowly turning in place. One morning, the clerk who relieved me asked why there was a handprint on the inside of the front door at shoulder height. There wasn't one by the time I looked. Then came the voice. It happened on a Sunday, 3:12 a.m. again. The bell rang. I looked up. No one at the door. I looked into the mirror. No figure in aisle 3 this time. Instead, I caught him in the reflection of the pastry case beside the counter, standing almost next to me. I turned instantly. Nothing there. Then, from my left, so close it felt like someone had leaned toward my ear, I heard a voice that sounded raw and full of water say, "He still waits by the truck," I shouted. Not screamed exactly, but loud enough to hear the panic in my own voice. I stumbled backward into a display of lighters and nearly took the whole rack down. When I looked toward the front windows, I saw Daniel again, not directly, but in the reflection of the office window glass. He was standing by the entrance, and outside, just beyond the edge of the parking lot light, there was something taller than him. Still, watching the store. That was the last night I worked completely alone. I told Karen the next morning that I was done. She didn't argue. She just nodded and said, "You lasted longer than most." That sentence made me feel sick in a way the actual sightings hadn't, because it meant there had been enough people before me to make that a meaningful comparison. I asked how many had seen him. That sentence made me feel sick in a way the actual sightings hadn't, because it meant there had been enough people before me to make that a meaningful comparison. I asked how many had seen him. She said, "Enough." I asked whether anyone had really looked into Daniel's disappearance after all the weird stuff started. She gave me this look I still remember because it was tired more than anything else. Then she said, "People think once they know where a story probably ends, they don't have to care how it got there." That stayed with me. 2 weeks after I quit, a local man found human remains in a drainage area behind an abandoned equipment shed near the old service road. Not in the creek. Not where they'd searched hardest. Half a mile from the store. The remains were identified as Daniel Mercer. According to what spread around town afterward, investigators believed he had gotten out of the truck alive after it slid near the creek embankment during the storm. He had likely been concussed, hypothermic, or both. Somehow he made it to Harlow's Market, asked for help, and then left again before anyone kept him there long enough to save him. He didn't die in the creek. He died after making it close to help. That fact changed the whole story for me. Because before that, even with all the strange things, part of me still wanted to think of it like a haunting in the abstract. A weird local legend attached to a place. But Daniel wasn't abstract. He had come in alive, shaking, soaked, disoriented, asking for help. And in the confusion of a bad shift and a bad storm and a few ordinary workplace distractions, the chance had slipped. No one murdered him, no one dragged him back out. That's what made it worse. He was lost through a series of ordinary failures. And ordinary failures are harder to forgive because they're so easy to imagine yourself inside. After the remains were found, according to Karen, the store changed. The bell stopped ringing at 3:12 a.m. No more phantom slips. No more wet footprints. No figure in the convex mirror. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 3 months later, I stopped there in daylight for gas on my way out of town. Karen was working. The place looked normal in the kind of aggressive way bright afternoon light can make anything look normal. People buying drinks. A guy filling up at Pump 4. Local radio playing too softly over the ceiling speaker. I almost didn't ask. Then, while she was ringing me up, I said, "Has anything weird happened since they found him?" She paused. Then she said, "Not him." I felt my stomach tighten immediately. I asked what that meant. She glanced toward the back hall. Then, very quietly, she said, "Whatever he kept looking at through the front door never came inside while he was here." I don't remember what I said after that. I know I left quickly. That was almost 3 years ago. The store is still there. Different owner now. Different branding. Samey building, samey lot, samey woods, samey stretch of road. I have never gone back after midnight. Sometimes I still drive that route, but if it's late, I keep going. I don't stop for gas there, even if I need it. I don't care how irrational that sounds. Because what stayed with me was never just Daniel showing up. It was the look on his face in that camera frame the night the power went out. He wasn't trying to scare anyone. He was scared, and that changes things. A ghost, if that's what he was, is one kind of story. A man returning to the last place he asked for help is another. But a man returning because something else followed him there, that's worse. A lot worse. For a long time, I tried not to think about the details too much. Then one night, about a year after quitting, I was having trouble sleeping and started reading old local news archives online. Mostly because I wanted to know whether there had ever been anything else tied to that stretch of road. There was not one big headline, just a handful of small, local, easily forgotten things. A deer hunter in the 90s who claimed he saw someone standing on the shoulder during heavy rain, and then found no footprints. After the remains were found, according to Karen, the store changed. The bell stopped ringing at 3:12 a.m. No more phantom slips. No more wet footprints. No figure in the convex mirror. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 3 months later, I stopped there in daylight for gas on my way out of town. Karen was working. The place looked normal in the kind of aggressive way bright afternoon light can make anything look normal. People buying drinks. A guy filling up at Pump 4. Local radio playing too softly over the ceiling speaker. I almost didn't ask. Then, while she was ringing me up, I said, "Has anything weird happened since they found him?" She paused. Then she said, "Not him." I felt my stomach tighten immediately. I asked what that meant. She glanced toward the back hall. Then, very quietly, she said, "Whatever he kept looking at through the front door never came inside while he was here." I don't remember what I said after that. I know I left quickly. That was almost 3 years ago. The store is still there. Different owner now. Different branding. Samey buildings, samey lots, samey woods, samey stretch of road. I have never gone back after midnight. Sometimes I still drive that route, but if it's late, I keep going. I don't stop for gas there, even if I need it. I don't care how irrational that sounds. Because what stayed with me was never just Daniel showing up. It was the look on his face in that camera frame the night the power went out. He wasn't trying to scare anyone. He was scared, and that changes things. A ghost, if that's what he was, is one kind of story. A man returning to the last place he asked for help is another. But a man returning because something else followed him there, that's worse. A lot worse. For a long time, I tried not to think about the details too much. Then one night, about a year after quitting, I was having trouble sleeping and started reading old local news archives online. Mostly because I wanted to know whether there had ever been anything else tied to that stretch of road. There was not one big headline, just a handful of small, local, easily forgotten things. A deer hunter in the 90s who claimed he saw someone standing on the shoulder during heavy rain, and then found no footprints. A minor traffic accident report mentioning a driver who swerved because a person was in the road near Miller's Creek, though no pedestrian was found. An old letter to the editor complaining that the service road should be blocked off because people go missing out there more often than makes sense. That phrase bothered me. More often than makes sense. Not enough to become famous. Not enough to become a town myth everybody agreed on. Just enough to become a local discomfort. I asked Karen about it the next time I saw her by chance at a grocery store months later. She said there had always been stories about that road. Drivers seeing someone near the tree line in storms. A man flagged down by what he thought was a stranded motorist only to find nobody there when he turned around. A volunteer firefighter who refused to talk about why he stopped taking the creek route after dark. I asked if she thought Daniel had seen whatever those people had seen. She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, "I think he brought it close enough for somebody else to notice." That answer still unsettles me because it suggests something I have never really been able to shake. Maybe Daniel didn't come back because he was lost. Maybe he came back because the store was the last bright place he reached. The last place he was still a person asking for help, not just another story ending out by the creek. And maybe the reason he kept appearing in aisle 3 at the register in the mirror on the cameras was not because he was trapped there. Maybe he was trying to point. That would explain why he kept directing attention to the back hall or the front door, why he never felt aggressive, why the fear around him always seemed to come from something adjacent, not from him directly. There was one more thing Karen told me later that I almost wish she hadn't. Apparently, a week after they identified Daniel's remains, one of the morning employees unlocked the stockroom and found every case of bottled water stacked in a straight line facing the back door. Not toppled, not messy, just turned. Like an audience. No one admitted doing it. Cameras didn't catch it because there still wasn't a stockroom camera. The owner at the time blamed pranking employees. Karen didn't. Neither did I. At some point after that, they finally installed a camera in the back hall. I know this because I looked up a job posting for the place maybe 6 months later out of curiosity and saw new interior photos in the listing. In one of them, you could see the little black dome camera near the hall corner. For a second, in a way I'm not proud of, I considered asking whether anything changed after that. I never did. Some things stop feeling like questions and start feeling like invitations. A couple of times people have asked me the obvious thing. Why didn't I report more of it? Why didn't I push harder? Why didn't I insist the police reopen everything sooner? The answer is complicated and not flattering, partly because I was 24 and broke and tired and embarrassed by how unbelievable it all sounded. Partly because until Daniel's remains were found, everything could still be dismissed as equipment, stress, mirrors, poor sleep, suggestion. And partly because once you're inside an unsettling situation long enough, your brain starts protecting you by normalizing it in pieces. That may be the part of the story I'm most uncomfortable with. Not that I was scared, that I adapted. You can adapt to almost anything if it arrives slowly enough. A bell at 3:12 a.m., a figure in a mirror, a phantom receipt, wet footprints, a voice, a shape outside the door. If those had all happened in one night, I would have run and never gone back. But that's not how fear usually enters your life. It trains you gradually. It lets you keep functioning just long enough that leaving feels complicated. That's true for jobs, for towns, for relationships, for buildings, for stories. The most dangerous things are often the things you learn to work around. I think about that when I think about Karen too. She stayed, long before me, long after me. I've asked myself whether that means she was braver than I was, more resigned than I was, or just more trapped. Maybe all three. Maybe once the store became part of her life for enough years, weirdness just turned into another category of maintenance, like a broken cooler fan or a difficult regular. That's what places do. They absorb what should have driven people out and turn it into routine. The only thing I know for sure is that Karen believed Daniel came in for help. That part she never softened. He came in, he asked. Then he was gone, and for months, maybe longer. Something about that remained unfinished. One winter after I quit, I ran into a former Harlow's delivery driver at a bar, and after enough conversation, asked whether he ever noticed anything strange at the station. He got quiet. Then he said he hated unloading there before dawn. I asked why. He said once, while backing toward the side delivery door around 4 a.m., he looked in the mirror and thought he saw someone standing just inside the tree line beyond the lot. Not moving. Just watching. He assumed it was some local drunk or a guy waiting for a ride. But when he looked again a second later, there was nothing there. The part that stayed with him, he said, was not the figure. It was that when he pulled up to the side door, Karen was already standing outside smoking, and before he could mention it, she asked him, "Did it stay by the trees?" Not "did you see someone," not "what's wrong." Did it stay by the trees? That suggests she knew a lot more than she ever told me. I don't blame her exactly. Sometimes when people live with something strange long enough, they stop explaining it because explaining makes it sound either ridiculous or too real. Silence becomes easier. Still, I think about what she must have seen before I ever worked there. Enough to know not to call out if the bell rang and no one came in. Enough to know the mirrors mattered. Enough to know the back hall was worse. Enough to ask me if the man looked wet. That's not folklore, that's pattern recognition. The more distance I get from the story, the less interested I am in deciding whether Daniel was literally haunting the store in some clean supernatural sense. That question matters less to me now than it used to. Because whatever was happening, the emotional truth of it feels clear. A man in trouble reached the last lit place on a dark stretch of road. He didn't get the help he needed fast enough. He disappeared. Then the place where he stopped carried him afterward. That part, at least, feels believable to me in a way bigger ghost theories don't. Places do hold things, maybe not spiritually in the way people mean when they say haunted, but atmospherically, psychologically, morally. A place where someone almost survived doesn't feel the same afterward. A place where a chance was missed doesn't always go back to being just a place. If that sounds like guilt talking, maybe it is. But guilt doesn't make bells ring on shut doors. It doesn't make wet footprints appear. It doesn't put a figure on camera that isn't there when you look up. Or maybe it does. In ways I don't fully understand. That's the problem with real experiences. They don't care whether the explanation sounds satisfying. They just happen. Then you live around them. The most disturbing thing I ever physically saw there happened on the second to last night before I quit, and I almost forgot to mention it because at the time it felt less dramatic than the bigger events. I was wiping down the coffee station around 2:50 a.m. when I noticed the front lot looked brighter than usual, not the pumps, past the pumps, out near the edge of the road where the light from the station started to weaken. There was a figure standing there far enough away that I couldn't make out details tall. Still, I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to decide whether it was a signpost I'd somehow never noticed or a person standing in the dark facing the store. Then a truck passed on the road. Its headlights swept over that section for half a second. Nothing was there. That unsettled me more than some of the bigger incidents because it happened before 3:12 a.m. Before the hour when I was already bracing for something. It suggested the boundaries of whatever this was weren't as neat as I wanted them to be. There was one final detail that I didn't learn until after I'd quit. Karen called me one afternoon, which she had never done before. Her voice sounded strange. Not panicked, just thinner somehow. She told me she was only calling because she thought I should know the owner had finally decided to remove the old bell mechanism above the front door and replace the whole unit after another employee complained it was going off at random times. I asked if that fixed it. She said yes. Then there was a pause. Then she said, "Now the knocking comes from the glass." I didn't say anything. She said she hadn't seen Daniel since they found him. Not once. But twice in the last month, a little after 3 a.m. Something had tapped on the front door from the outside 3 slow times, even though the lot was empty. When she checked the camera, there was nothing standing there. I asked if she thought it was the same thing that had been outside before. She said, "I think whatever made him afraid knows he isn't between it and the store anymore." I didn't go back after that. I still haven't. And I know how all of this sounds when you tell it start to finish. It sounds shaped, too neat in some places, too eerie in others. Like the kind of story that would be easier to tell if I leaned into the supernatural harder or stripped it down into pure missing person tragedy. But the truth is it felt both at once. That's why it stayed with me. On one level, this was just a man who got into a wreck during a storm, made it to a gas station, didn't receive help quickly enough, wandered off disoriented and died of exposure or injury not far from safety. That happens. That's real. That's terrible enough. On another level, something about his last movements or what he saw or what followed him from the road never sat right in that store afterward. And if you want me to be completely honest, the detail that bothers me most isn't any of the sightings. It's the line I heard beside the counter. He still waits by the truck, because that suggests Daniel wasn't the only unfinished part of that road. It suggests there was something still at the original scene. Something that had not crossed fully into the store. Something he knew enough about to fear even after death, if that's what this was. I've gone back and forth over the years trying to decide whether that line meant another person, another victim, or something less human and less explainable. I don't have a satisfying answer. I only know that the fear I felt around Daniel was never really fear of him. It was fear of what he was looking past me at. That's an important distinction. He never rushed me, never seemed angry. He appeared weighted, pointed, warned. If anything, he felt like a person trapped in the wrong side of an unfinished message. The thing outside did not. That thing, whatever it was, felt patient. And if you've ever had a moment in life where you realize patience can be more frightening than aggression, you know exactly what I mean. Aggression is immediate. Patience means time is on its side. I don't know what happened on that road before Daniel crashed. I don't know whether he saw someone, picked someone up, swerved for something, or encountered whatever had made that stretch uneasy long before he entered the store. I only know there were older stories, older sightings, older discomforts tied to the creek and the service road. And Daniel somehow became part of that chain. Maybe he was the only one who made it as far as the lights. Maybe that's why he stayed visible. Maybe the others didn't. That thought has bothered me enough that once, a long time after all this, I searched county records and old articles again, trying to see how many minor incidents clustered around that same route. More than I liked, fewer than would ever make a real case. That's how some places get away with keeping their reputation. Nothing large enough for headlines. Just a pattern of small unease, a driver swerves. A man disappears. Someone sees a figure in heavy rain. A store employee learns not to call out immediately when the bell rings. That's all it takes. A handful of fragments. No single proof. The worst kinds of fear can survive for decades inside that amount of uncertainty. I've told this story to very few people in real life because most reactions fall into two categories. Either they want it to be more supernatural than it was, with clear rules and a monster you can name, or they want it to be less strange than it was, with every detail explained away by exhaustion, stress, old equipment, and local rumor. Maybe both of those are easier than sitting in the middle where I still sit, knowing something happened, knowing a man came in asking for help, knowing he came back in some form afterward, and knowing there was something else in the story that never fully stepped into the light. That's the version I have. Not cleaner than that, not worse than that. Just true enough to have stayed with me. And every once in a while, usually when I'm driving late and see a gas station glowing by itself off a dark road, I think about how thin the line is between a place you stop for coffee and a place that becomes the last bright point in someone's life. Most nights, those places are nothing. A register, a microwave, a tired clerk, a bell over a door. Then one night something slips, a storm, a mischance. A man too cold and too hurt to explain himself clearly. A worker too busy to understand what matters in time. After that, the place may still look normal, but it isn't. And if you spend enough nights there, sometimes it lets you know. Option 1. I don't know what stood outside that store. I only know Daniel Mercer was afraid of it. And whatever he saw on that road, he brought the warning all the way to the last place that still had lights on. I never went back after midnight. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but some places stop being businesses after a certain hour. They become evidence.